The strangest thing about losing everything is realizing who was quietly waiting for you to fail. Claire Bennett thought about those words as she stood on the front walkway of the house she had called home for nearly 12 years. The late afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the lawn while a warm Texas breeze moved through the trees. At her feet sat a single navy blue suitcase, the only thing she had chosen to take that day. Jason Walker stood near the front door with his arms crossed, looking more relieved than sad. Their divorce had been finalized less than an hour earlier, and the final signature seemed to have erased every trace of kindness that once existed between them. "You'll be fine," he said casually, as though he were discussing the weather instead of the end of a marriage. Claire nodded without arguing. The neighbors across the street pretended not to watch, but she could feel their eyes following every movement. Nobody came over. Nobody asked if she needed help. In moments like this, people often chose comfort over courage. Jason glanced at his watch and sighed impatiently. "I really need to get back inside," he said. Claire looked at the house one last time. She remembered painting the kitchen walls, planting the flowers near the porch, and spending countless evenings believing she was building a future that would last forever. Yet standing there now, she felt something unexpected. Not anger. Not even heartbreak. Just clarity. She quietly picked up her suitcase and walked toward her car. Jason never noticed the small smile that appeared for a second before she opened the trunk. He was too busy celebrating what he thought was a victory. What he didn't know was that Claire had spent years making sacrifices he had never bothered to understand. What he didn't know was that several opportunities she had walked away from were still waiting for her. And what he definitely didn't know was that the story he had already decided was over had not even reached its most important chapter. As Claire drove away, her phone lit up on the passenger seat. A message appeared from an unfamiliar number. She stopped at a red light and read the first line. Her expression changed immediately. For the first time all day, genuine surprise crossed her face. Then the light turned green. Claire set the phone down, took a steady breath, and continued driving into a future that looked nothing like the one Jason imagined for her. Claire drove nearly 40 miles before pulling into the parking lot of a modest apartment complex on the north side of Dallas. The message she had received at the traffic light remained open on her phone, and she read it again before stepping out of the car. The sender was Olivia Grant, a former colleague she had not spoken to in almost 8 years. The message was short but impossible to ignore. It simply asked if Claire would be willing to meet the following morning because an opportunity had finally become available. Most people would have assumed the timing was a coincidence. Claire did not believe in coincidences anymore. Too many doors had quietly remained unlocked throughout her life, even after she chose not to walk through them. That evening she carried her suitcase into a small furnished apartment she had rented earlier that week without telling anyone. The space was simple. A couch, a coffee table, a small kitchen, and a bedroom barely large enough for a queen-size bed. Yet as she placed her keys on the counter, she felt lighter than she had in years. Across town, Jason was celebrating. His brother Mark and 2 close friends joined him for dinner. They laughed about how quickly life could change. Jason made several comments about how Claire would probably struggle on her own. Nobody challenged him. Nobody asked what role he might have played in the collapse of the marriage. People often accepted the version of events that required the least amount of thought. The next morning Claire arrived at a downtown office building just after 9 o'clock. The glass tower overlooked the city skyline, and the lobby looked even more impressive than she remembered. Olivia greeted her with a warm smile. Within minutes they were sitting in a conference room discussing possibilities that Claire thought had disappeared long ago. Meanwhile, Jason continued enjoying the confidence that came from believing he knew everything about his former wife. That confidence followed him for several days. Then something unusual happened. During a business lunch, one of his clients mentioned a name that immediately caught his attention. Claire Bennett. Jason laughed and said it was probably someone else. The client looked confused. "You know Claire Bennett?" he asked. Jason nodded casually. The client leaned back in his chair. That is interesting, he said. A lot of people would love the chance to know her. Jason smiled politely, but the comment stayed with him long after lunch ended. For the first time since the divorce, a small crack appeared in the story he had been telling himself. And he had no idea how much larger that crack was about to become. Jason tried to dismiss the conversation from the business lunch, but the comment followed him through the rest of the week. A lot of people would love the chance to know her. The words made no sense. Claire had always seemed content living a quiet life. She never talked about accomplishments, connections, or ambitions. At least that was what Jason believed. The following Friday, he attended a networking event hosted at a hotel downtown. Events like this were routine for him. Familiar faces, predictable conversations, and endless business cards. Halfway through the evening, however, he heard Claire's name again. This time it came from two executives standing near the refreshment table. Neither noticed Jason listening. One of them spoke about an upcoming leadership summit while the other mentioned that securing Claire Bennett as a guest speaker would be a major achievement. Jason nearly laughed out loud. There had to be another Claire Bennett. There was simply no way they were talking about his former wife. Yet something about their tone made him hesitate. They spoke with admiration. Respect. The kind of respect people reserved for someone who had earned it over many years. Across town, Claire sat in a conference room reviewing documents with Olivia Grant and several members of a consulting group. The opportunity Olivia mentioned was larger than Claire expected. During the years of her marriage, she had quietly stepped away from projects that once consumed her schedule. She had never regretted prioritizing her family, but she had accepted that certain chapters of her life were permanently closed. Now she was discovering that some of those chapters had never truly ended. People still remembered her work. People still valued her ideas. More surprising than anything, people still wanted her involved. Claire approached the situation cautiously. She was not interested in proving anything to Jason. She was not trying to impress anyone. She simply wanted to move forward with dignity. Meanwhile, Jason became increasingly curious. Over the next several days he searched online, expecting to confirm that the executives had been discussing someone else. Instead, he found almost nothing. The search results were strangely limited. A few references. A handful of mentions. Enough to raise questions but not enough to answer them. That mystery bothered him more than certainty would have. Then another unexpected moment arrived. Late Monday afternoon, his client from the lunch meeting sent him an email containing a guest list for an upcoming charity gala. Jason scanned the names without much interest until he reached one entry near the top. Claire Bennett. Listed among prominent business leaders, philanthropists, and industry figures. Jason stared at the screen for several seconds. For the first time, he began to wonder whether the woman he thought he knew had been hiding far more than he ever imagined. The charity gala was scheduled for the following Saturday evening, and Jason spent the entire week thinking about the guest list. He told himself it was simple curiosity, nothing more. Yet every time he opened his email, his eyes drifted back to Claire's name. By Thursday, curiosity had become distraction. By Friday, it had become obsession. He started asking questions carefully, hoping nobody would notice how interested he suddenly seemed. Most people offered only vague answers. A few smiled when they heard Claire's name. Others reacted with immediate recognition. None of them reacted the way Jason expected. Nobody described her as someone's former spouse. Nobody described her as ordinary. Late Friday afternoon, Jason finally found someone willing to talk. During a meeting, he mentioned Claire's name to an older executive named Robert Hayes. The man's expression changed instantly. "Claire Bennett?" Robert asked. "You know Claire Bennett?" Jason nodded. "We were married." The room became strangely quiet. Robert looked genuinely surprised. Then he laughed softly, not in a cruel way but in disbelief. "That is remarkable," he said. "I have worked with some impressive people over the years, and Claire was always one of the smartest. Jason felt his stomach tighten. "Worked with?" he asked. Robert nodded. "Years ago. Before she stepped away from everything." Jason wanted to ask more questions, but Robert's phone rang, ending the conversation. The unfinished answer bothered him all weekend. Meanwhile, Claire continued meeting with professionals who had remained in contact with her old network. The more conversations she had, the more she realized how much she had underestimated her own reputation. Opportunities arrived from multiple directions. Invitations. Proposals. Partnerships. She reviewed each one carefully, determined not to let emotion guide her decisions. She had spent too many years placing her own goals second. Now she wanted to move forward thoughtfully rather than rush toward every possibility. On Saturday evening, the gala finally arrived. Jason entered the ballroom expecting a typical fundraising event. Crystal chandeliers illuminated the room while hundreds of guests filled the space with conversation and laughter. He scanned the crowd casually at first. Then he noticed something unusual. Several influential guests appeared to be waiting for someone. Their attention repeatedly shifted toward the entrance. A few minutes later, the room subtly changed. Conversations paused. Heads turned. Jason followed their gaze and felt his heartbeat accelerate. Claire had just entered the ballroom. She was not standing alone. More surprising than that, many of the people Jason recognized immediately began walking toward her. And judging by their reactions, they were not greeting a stranger. They were welcoming someone they deeply respected. Jason remained frozen near the edge of the ballroom as more people approached Claire. One conversation turned into 3, then 5, then 10. Everywhere he looked, someone seemed eager to speak with her. The confidence he had carried into the event slowly gave way to confusion. He had expected to see a woman rebuilding her life after a difficult divorce. Instead, he was watching someone move through the room with a quiet authority that could not be faked. Claire greeted each person warmly. She smiled, listened, and asked thoughtful questions. Nothing about her behavior suggested she was trying to impress anyone. That made the reactions around her even more remarkable. Respect like that was rarely demanded. It was earned. Jason eventually spotted Robert Hayes speaking with Claire near one of the large windows overlooking the city. Before he could approach them, another guest joined the conversation. Then another. Within minutes, a small crowd had formed. Curious, Jason moved closer. He stayed far enough away to avoid being noticed but close enough to hear fragments of the discussion. What he heard made even less sense than before. Several people referenced projects completed years earlier. Others mentioned business strategies that had become industry case studies. One woman credited Claire with helping launch a charitable initiative that now operated in multiple states. Jason listened carefully, trying to reconcile these stories with the woman he thought he knew. During their marriage, Claire rarely spoke about her past. Whenever professional achievements came up, she usually changed the subject. At the time, Jason interpreted that as a lack of ambition. Standing in the ballroom, he began wondering if he had misunderstood her completely. A few minutes later, the event organizer stepped onto the stage and welcomed everyone. Conversations gradually quieted. Jason expected a routine speech about fundraising goals. Instead, the organizer spent several minutes recognizing special guests whose contributions had influenced both business and charitable communities. Then he mentioned Claire by name. Applause immediately filled the room. Not polite applause. Genuine applause. The kind reserved for someone people sincerely admired. Jason felt a wave of disbelief. Around him, guests nodded approvingly while others smiled in Claire's direction. She appeared slightly uncomfortable with the attention, yet grateful. The organizer then revealed something that finally shifted Jason's perspective. Years earlier, before stepping away from public life, Claire had played a major role in developing a consulting framework that many organizations still use today. The framework had generated significant success for countless companies. Jason stared at the stage. For the first time, he realized that Claire had not spent years accomplishing nothing. She had spent years quietly carrying accomplishments so significant that entire industries still remembered them. Jason left the gala with more questions than answers. The drive home felt longer than usual, and for the first time in years, he found himself replaying conversations he had once dismissed. Small moments from the marriage suddenly looked different. He remembered occasions when Claire received unexpected phone calls and quietly stepped into another room. He remembered invitations she declined without explanation. He remembered people recognizing her name while traveling, only for Claire to quickly redirect the conversation. At the time, he barely noticed. Now every memory seemed important. The following week, curiosity pushed him further than before. He began researching Claire's professional history more seriously. What he discovered was frustratingly incomplete. There were references to leadership conferences, consulting projects, charitable foundations, and strategic initiatives, but many records listed her as a contributor rather than a public figure. The deeper he looked, the more he realized Claire had never been interested in recognition. She had built influence without building fame. That made understanding her far more difficult. Meanwhile, Claire's life continued moving forward. Meetings filled her calendar. Opportunities multiplied. One consulting organization formally invited her to join a national advisory board. Another group asked her to help guide a major expansion project. She accepted only a handful of invitations, focusing on work that aligned with her values. The most surprising part was how natural everything felt. She was not returning to a new world. She was returning to a world that had quietly been waiting for her. Several days later, Jason attended another business event. This time he arrived with a different perspective. Instead of introducing himself immediately, he listened. Before long, he heard Claire's name once again. A senior executive spoke about a successful turnaround project completed years earlier. Another person described a leadership model that had transformed multiple organizations. Both stories pointed back to the same source: Claire. As the conversations continued, Jason noticed a pattern. People rarely discussed her achievements first. They talked about her character, her integrity, her judgment, her willingness to help others succeed. Those qualities seemed to matter even more than the accomplishments themselves. That realization unsettled him. During their marriage, he had spent years measuring success through visible results: promotions, income, status. Yet the people who knew Claire best spoke about something entirely different. Late that evening, Jason received another surprise. An acquaintance forwarded an announcement regarding an upcoming National Leadership Summit. Among the featured keynote speakers was Claire Bennett. Her photograph appeared alongside several well-known industry leaders. Jason stared at the screen in disbelief. The woman he thought had lost everything was not rebuilding from the ground up. She was stepping back onto a stage that had always belonged to her. The National Leadership Summit took place 3 weeks later in Chicago, and Jason purchased a ticket almost immediately after seeing Claire's name on the speaker list. He told himself the decision was professional. He claimed he wanted to learn from industry experts. Deep down, however, he knew the truth. He needed answers. The ballroom hosting the summit was far larger than the charity gala. Hundreds of attendees filled the seats while cameras, sponsors, and media representatives moved throughout the venue. Jason arrived early and found a seat near the middle of the room. As the morning sessions began, he struggled to focus. His attention remained fixed on the schedule. Claire's keynote presentation was listed just before lunch. When the time finally arrived, the event moderator stepped onto the stage and began introducing the next speaker. The introduction lasted several minutes. At first, Jason listened casually. Then he started hearing details that sounded strangely familiar. The moderator described a groundbreaking consulting framework adopted by organizations across the country. He mentioned leadership programs that had influenced thousands of professionals. He referenced charitable initiatives that had expanded into multiple states. With each accomplishment, Jason felt increasingly uneasy. Every achievement pointed back to one person. Then Claire walked onto the stage. The audience immediately stood and applauded. Jason remained frozen in his seat. He looked around the room and saw executives, entrepreneurs, nonprofit leaders, and educators all giving her a standing ovation. The respect was undeniable. Claire thanked the audience and began speaking. Her presentation was thoughtful, practical, and deeply personal. She discussed leadership, resilience, and the importance of making decisions based on long-term values rather than temporary emotions. She never mentioned her divorce. She never spoke negatively about anyone. Yet several of her observations struck Jason harder than any criticism could have. At one point she explained how some people spend years hiding their potential because they choose to prioritize responsibilities that matter more than recognition. The audience listened carefully. Jason lowered his eyes. For the first time, he began understanding what had happened during their marriage. Claire had not lacked ambition. She had redirected it. She had chosen family over visibility. She had stepped away from opportunities that many people would have eagerly pursued. The greatest shock arrived after the presentation ended. During a networking session, Jason overheard two senior executives discussing Claire's career. One of them casually mentioned that before stepping away from public life, Claire had been considered one of the most influential strategic consultants in her field. The other executive nodded and added something that left Jason speechless. Half the success stories people celebrate today were built on systems Claire created years ago. In that moment, the final pieces began falling into place, and Jason realized he had spent more than a decade living beside someone whose true impact he had never bothered to understand. Jason returned home from Chicago carrying a weight that had nothing to do with business. For weeks he had been uncovering pieces of Claire's past, but the summit forced him to confront something far more uncomfortable. The problem was not that Claire had hidden her accomplishments. The problem was that he had never cared enough to ask. That realization followed him through every room of the house. He began noticing reminders of her everywhere. The coffee mug she used every morning. The book she left behind. The quiet routines he once considered ordinary. Looking back, he saw a pattern he had ignored for years. Claire had always supported his goals. She attended events when he needed encouragement. She listened when he faced challenges. She celebrated his successes without asking for recognition of her own. Yet when opportunities appeared for her, she often stepped aside. At the time, Jason interpreted those decisions as a lack of interest. Now he understood they had been sacrifices. A few days later, another revelation arrived unexpectedly. During a meeting with an older client named Harold Simmons, the conversation turned toward leadership influences. When Claire's name surfaced, Harold smiled immediately. "I owe part of my career to her," he said. Jason assumed he was exaggerating. Harold shook his head. "Not even close. 15 years ago, when my company was struggling, Claire developed the strategy that saved us. Most people never knew she was involved because she refused public credit." Jason sat silently. Harold continued. "That was always her way. She cared more about results than attention." Then Harold mentioned something that changed everything. The consulting framework everyone praised had generated enormous economic impact over the years. Hundreds of companies used versions of Claire's original ideas. Entire leadership programs were built around principles she helped create. Jason felt his chest tighten. The scale of her influence was larger than he imagined. More importantly, he realized Claire had never used any of it to make herself appear superior. She had never mentioned the awards, the recognition, or the respect she earned. She simply moved forward with humility. That evening Jason opened an old storage box containing documents from earlier years of their marriage. Inside he found conference materials, letters, and photographs he barely remembered. One photo stopped him completely. Claire stood beside several nationally recognized business leaders at an event that took place years before they married. On the back, someone had written a simple note. Thank you for changing the future of our organization. Jason stared at the message for a long time. For months he believed he had lost a marriage. Now he was beginning to understand that he had lost something far greater. He had lost the chance to truly know the remarkable woman who had quietly stood beside him all those years. Several weeks passed before Jason finally gathered the courage to contact Claire. He rewrote the message multiple times before sending it. In the end, he chose honesty. He did not make excuses. He did not blame circumstances. He simply asked if she would be willing to meet for coffee and talk. To his surprise, Claire agreed. They met on a quiet Saturday afternoon at a small cafe overlooking a park. The conversation began politely. Two people discussing familiar memories, shared experiences, and the passage of time. Yet beneath the surface, both understood why they were really there. Jason eventually looked down at his coffee cup and admitted the truth. He told Claire that everything he had learned over the past several months had changed the way he viewed their marriage. He spoke about the summit, the gala, the conversations, and the discoveries. Most of all, he spoke about regret. Not because of her success. Not because of her reputation. But because he finally understood how much of her he had never taken the time to know. Claire listened quietly. When he finished, she thanked him for his honesty. Then she said something Jason would remember for the rest of his life. She explained that the accomplishments people were celebrating now had never been the most important part of her story. The most important part was the years she willingly devoted to the people she loved. She never considered those years a sacrifice to regret. What hurt was realizing that those choices had often gone unnoticed. Jason felt every word. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, he asked the question that had been growing inside him since the divorce. He wondered whether there was any possibility they could start over. Claire smiled gently. There was kindness in her expression, but there was also certainty. She told him she did not hate him. She was not angry. In many ways, she had already forgiven him. However, forgiveness and returning were not the same thing. The divorce had not ended their marriage in a single day. It had simply revealed what had been missing for years. Claire explained that she was finally building a life that reflected who she truly was. For the first time in a very long time, she felt completely at peace. Jason nodded slowly. Deep down, he already knew the answer before asking the question. When they left the cafe, they walked together to the parking lot. Claire wished him well. Jason did the same. Then she got into her car and drove away. This time, he did not watch with confusion or pride. He watched with understanding. Some losses happen because people make mistakes. Others happen because they fail to appreciate what they already have. And as Claire disappeared into the distance, Jason finally understood the difference.